Welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Carledge, and I'm passionate about helping you master your animal training skills using the most positive and least intrusive approaches. Here at ATA, we understand that navigating the vast challenges you encounter in training requires a comprehensive base of knowledge and experience. It's common to face obstacles and rough patches on your journey that can leave you feeling overwhelmed and stressed. Therefore, since 2015, we've been on a mission to empower animal training geeks worldwide. We've aided thousands in developing their skills, expanding their knowledge, boosting their confidence, and maximizing their positive impact on all the animal and human learners they work with. We are excited to do the same for you. Simply visit www.atamember.com, join our vibrant community, and geek out with us. And of course, in the meantime, enjoy this free podcast episode as we explore new ways to help you supercharge your training skills, grow your knowledge, and build your confidence, so that you can craft a life that positively impacts every learner you encounter. We will start today's episode where I'm thrilled to welcome back to the show for part 2 of our conversation, the fantastic Megan Sanders. Now, if you haven't listened to the first part of our conversation, you can find it in the previous episode on whatever app you're listening to the show on. In that episode, we explored Megan's journey and the importance of becoming uncomfortable and going out there and seeking opportunities, amongst many other things. So it's definitely worth a listen, and what led her to her current role as zoological behavior consultant for Susan Friedman's Behavior Works. However, if you haven't listened to it, you are, of course, welcome to start here with part 2, where you're going to gain plenty of insights to help grow your skills, knowledge, and confidence in animal training. So let's dive in. But first, Megan, thanks so much for coming back to hang out with us again on the Animal Training Academy podcast show.
Of course.
I am pumped to geek out on this one with you because it mirrors so much of what I've been doing with zoo teams and building their animal training skills. In today's episode, we're going to be exploring a smart, efficient way to teach animal trainers at zoos and or I should say, at any other place where animals are cared for. And this is by using a special hands-on training game that we've talked about many times here on the podcast and within the animal training and membership, and that is PORTL, which combined with trainers giving feedback to each other can help trainers become more skilled and consistent in what they do, because ultimately better trained humans can lead to better trained, less stressed animals. And so this was the basis of your thesis, am I correct?
Yeah. So this really was just looking at, a lot of the literature that we have available, the empirical literature. It applies our behavior principles to our non-human learners. So how do we apply our learning principles to them? And I really wanted to kind of shift that lens back a little bit and have that applied to our appliers. So how do we take the same care and look at how we are teaching our trainers, and can we look at that a little bit more systematically to make sure that our outcomes are we working with our trainers with the same precision that we're working with our animals, because that's just as important. We actually can look and get into, I'll talk a little bit about that, that can maybe change our outcomes with our non-human learners, with our animal learners, the same way, or impact them in the same way that direct interaction can. So I love the teaching piece of my job. I really enjoy the human interaction. And so this kind of was a natural fit for my thesis work. So it was a fun project to get to work on.
So in part 1, you said that you originally planned to start this in around 2020.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I put in my application in 2019 and then I pulled it back out.
and you also suggested in part one that you were glad, like in hindsight, like it worked out quite well.
Yeah, I don't know that this would have been my thesis topic had I done the master's program in 2019 or 2020. I don't know that it would have been on my radar to focus on trainers. I think I probably would have gone for something that was more animal centric. And I think for what I really am interested in and the things that I enjoy most about consulting and where my interests in the job lie, this is a much better fit for me. And this was what really stuck with me when it was my first idea for a thesis. And I kind of like went down some other little side paths to sort of test some things out. And this is where I kept coming back to. So this was where I landed. And I don't think this would have been the case in if I had done the program earlier. So putting it off, COVID and all sorts of other things happened that actually ended up being maybe a good thing for me. And having it happen when it did gave me this. So it was fun. Like, it's just a weird thing to say because it was so much work, but it was actually really fun to work through it and then see the data come out on the other side and give us some feedback that we wanted to investigate and see what would happen.
So explain to the listeners of the show, because a lot of them would not have participated in having a zoo consult come in and work with them to install some programs or to be kind of a week-long injection of knowledge and inspiration or whatever the individual consultancy looks like. But what do you do when you go into zoos, and what were you seeing that made you start asking these questions and wanting to do your thesis on the human learners?
Yeah, so it depends. We tailor every visit to what that specific facility needs. But there's some commonalities that we see across the board. And a lot of times we're going in and teaching some common skills that are just needed for any animal training that we do. And a lot of that ends up being mechanical skills in terms of cueing and reinforcement delivery, bridge timing. So a lot of those really foundational skills that all of us can brush up on, and as we continue to learn, there's so much work going on across the field that we're all sort of interweaving with each other, and we're continuing to learn more and improve. We try to incorporate that as we learn more into our consulting. So we're bringing in, as we learn new things, we try to bring those along with us. So, a good example would be Mary Hunter has kind of put some great language to reinforcement systems and things like that. So as, we learn more about that, we'll bring that into our consulting and try to incorporate that and the benefits that we see with that. And as we've learned things from her. And so we have been trying things out and are always looking to improve how we teach. And anecdotally, we have a ton of information on what we think works. So, we'll try stuff out. We think that we see improvement in our trainers, but we don't have any data on that per se. And there really isn't a lot of literature out there. So when I started thinking about this as a thesis topic, I obviously started to do a lit review, and there's just not a lot of information out there in terms of teaching animal trainers how to train. There's very few studies, like barely a little tiny handful. And I leveraged those really heavily, the few that I did find. So it was something that I thought, this might be somewhere that, we could actually use some empirical literature to start to lay some foundation to help us figure out how to best teach trainers how to apply the science in the most efficient way and effective way possible. And so that's really kind of where it started from. I know that Amy Shells has been on your program before and has talked a little bit about some of the things that we do when we go out and consult. We do use PORTL. So another shout out to Mary Hunter for that. Great program that we've been able to utilize in a lot of different ways. And then for facilities that can support it, we've done work where we'll take PORTL programs and then work with goats has been a nice way to kind of take that and generalize it into a field setting where we can start to kind of put those skills into action with something that moves around a little bit more. So we knew that it kind of anecdotally worked, and we saw some progress, or we saw some skills that we thought were being transferred. But again, I didn't have any data that I could say, yeah, this is really effective. So I wanted to see if I could have that sort of model that we were utilizing when we would go out and teach, have that be something that I could gather data on and say empirically, yeah, this is actually producing behavior change that I can generalize out into the field, and then possibly generalize into other species. And here's the data to support that. So that's where it came from. The other piece that I wanted to layer on top of that was to see if it actually affected animal performance. So, we talk a lot about prerequisite skills and errorless learning and all of these things. We talk about it in terms of how we approach our animals' learning. So if we're going to teach a blood draw to an animal, we would break that out into prerequisite skills for that animal and teach all of those skills ahead of time in a low distraction environment where it would be really easy for them to learn. So, maybe we would teach a, handhold and a easy spot for that animal to learn. And, we would make sure that they had a reinforcement system that was really solid and fluent ahead of time. And then we would bring all those pieces together and start moving them into more what we would call maybe difficult situations. So wherever that blood draw was actually going to take place. But we a lot of times see trainers have to put all these pieces together all at once. So we put them in front of, the zebra, or we put them in front of the lion, and we're like, okay, and now we want you to do this with your hands, and we want you to do this. And oh, by the way, you're having to do your criteria at the same time, and. So we're not necessarily building up the prerequisite skills, and we're putting them into these really complex situations and having them try to acquire all these skills at the same time. So this is a little bit of a nod to that in terms of, can we build these prerequisite skills in what we would consider a simpler environment? So call it the ex situ environment, which is basically just a classroom setting, and then using PORTL to be able to support that. And then looking at, does that translate out into the field? And then by doing that, by getting rid of all of those errors that we would typically make in front of the animal, does it actually improve learning outcomes? So do we see our animals make fewer errors based on the trainer making fewer errors? So it was a little bit of a layered approach to this. I kind of stacked a few things in there. But, wanting to see, is our anecdotal, what we see, is that true? Does it hold up under the scrutiny of actual data?
Yeah, well, and was part of your study as well, like the benefit of it being in that context, building your skill up in a classroom environment versus in front of a zebra, and love the goats in there rather than jumping from classroom PORTL to being in front of the lion, being in front of learners that like to approach you and want the food you have or whatever reinforcers you have. It's interesting because it's so logical to build your skill up with successive approximations.
Yeah, for shaping the trainer, basically.
yeah, which is so logical, right? But it's not something that potentially we generalize our knowledge to, would you say?
Yeah, and we're getting better at it. Certainly when I first started training, it was like they threw a bucket and a stick at you and they were like, good luck to you. Let us know how it goes. And I think we've progressed past that, but there still are times where I think we put trainers in situations that maybe it's more than they're ready to handle, or they're going to make more errors than they need to make. So this is an approach where we're looking at how do we maybe more systematically approach teaching our trainers. We're so careful about how we break down behavior with our non-human learners. How do we take that same approach to our trainers as well? We want to be as I want to be as sensitive to their learning programs as we are to our animals' learning programs. Can we set them up to be more successful as possible by looking at the way that we are designing their instructional programs as well? For me, as a consultant, that's a high priority. I'm always watching two learners in every session. I'm watching the animal learner. That's outcome is obviously hugely important, but I'm also watching my person, my human. Are they mechanically, are they doing what they need to be doing? How are they tracking the contingencies of that environment as well? Are they frustrated, and what would those behaviors look like? Are they able to pick up, and are they able to take in feedback that we've been giving them in that context, or do we need to step out of that context and acquire those skills somewhere else? So, when you're coaching, you're kind of tracking multiple different things. And so this is a way to kind of figure out, is there a way that we can really solidify and make fluent all of those things that I would be tracking during a session ahead of time, and remove as many of those errors as possible, so that all that person has to focus on when they get in front of whatever species it is that they're training. And, this, I talk about zoos because that's where I work the most, but this could be anywhere. I'm thinking like shelter animals, and especially once you get into things that are larger. And this doesn't even have to be, again, if we're in a shelter situation, if you have a dog with an unknown history, or a dog that comes in that has hackles up and teeth bared, you don't want to be thinking about where your hands are. You want to be fully focused on the behavior of that animal, and how they are responding to that dialogue that you're having through your training, as opposed to, am I hitting home position? Is my hand going to the bucket at the right time? All of those mechanical pieces, if we can get those as fluent and almost automatic as possible ahead of time, more of the thought process, if you want to think of it that way, more of your brain power can be going into having that really smooth dialogue and making sure that is going as smoothly as possible, and not so much about all of the other myriad of things that a trainer's having to track and do. And all of that is communication too, what your hands are doing, what your body's doing. So if we can take care of that ahead of time, it makes the whole session go smoother.
Yeah, and I feel like feedback I often get is trainers wanting to become more confident. And then we ask, what does that look like? And to me, what you've described is what that looks like. If you get those processes so they don't have to think about them and they can focus on the animal, then they're going to, hypothetically, but some data would be nice, get more success.
Yep. And it gives them the why. It's not just saying, I want you to put your hand in home position, but this gives the opportunity to say, and here's why. This is what it's communicating to your learner potentially. This is why I would like you to do X, Y, and Z. So it gives them the opportunity. I mentioned before, like, one of the things that I appreciate so much about behavior analysis is that it gives you the why behind behavior. So it's not just do this because I said. It's, I'm giving you this series of steps to follow, but here's the logic behind it. This is what your hand moving at other times is communicating to your learner, and that might be an unintended cue for your animal to be throwing in extra behavior, which is causing them to move more. Christy calls it junk behavior, which is like my favorite label for that, in between. So I think it also gives them an opportunity to have more tools to make their own decisions when you're not standing there. I think the high watermark for a consultant is, I want you to be able to make these choices when I'm not behind you saying, move your hand now. And having the why for those is a really key component to that. So a really solid systematic teaching system, I think, builds that in. So you have, not just the what do I have to do, but here's also why I'm doing it.
I remember when I first met Susan, me in 2010 at a parrot conference in Australia. And I hadn't heard of her before that conference, even though I was going to the conference and she was speaking. I'd gone there specifically to meet Steve Martin, and and I was asking Steve who his biggest influence was, and he said Susan, and I said who's Susan, and he pointed across the room. But he said to me the reason that she's been so impactful is because she's given me exactly what you just described. She's helped me understand and put language to the things that I've been doing for the past X number of years in my career. I'm just curious, why do you think the why is so important? And I'm going to throw a theory at you, and then say no, I think something completely different, or yeah, like I resonate with that and build on that. But going back to something we talked about in part one, got these thoughts swirling around in our head, and putting language to things. So even just having language, and understanding what positive reinforcement means, or what errorless learning is, or what reinforcement systems is, and the gift from Mary Hunter is giving us a name for this, and operationalizing what that looks like. And language, for me anyway, just helps me digest information better, process things better. But I hadn't really thought about it in terms of, is it the language in the why that helps us, or is it just the logic, understanding the logic? What is it for you? Why is the why so important?
I think the why is so you can identify it when you see it. So, and it's true, it's not just the language, but it's the observable language. It's not the label, it has to be observable and measurable. So it has to be specific language. It can't just be any language. And it is the fact that, it can't just be, it when you see it, or I'll know it when I see it kind of thing. It needs to be so specific that it's something that you can identify in any context. So it's why being able to talk about positive reinforcement, we have a really clear definition of what that looks like. It's, a consequence that when following a behavior, that behavior will increase or maintain over trials. So we could watch behavior over time and know really clearly whether or not that behavior is increasing, maintaining, or decreasing. And based on that data, based on the actual tangible data that we take, we know whether or not it fits into that operational definition. And that's why I think it's so important, when we start to get into talking about all of these things, when we talk about, a home position, or, whatever it is that we're talking about. It's not just that it looks nice when I have my hand at my belt buckle in between repetitions. I want to talk about the observable behaviors that I should expect to see when I hit home position, and what I would expect to see when I don't hit home position. So that's the why to it. There's going to be observable behavior that I can tag on to that. That then we can talk about with the learner. Basically all of those little nuances, all with your hand mechanics, they're all ABC contingencies that we can track. So, if my hand is sitting or moving towards my bait bag, that's a cue for the animal to probably start moving towards the bag. And if historically food then came out of the bag and went to the animal's mouth, that's a positive reinforcer in theory, that then is just reinforced moving towards the bag. So we can break all of this out into ABC contingencies, and at the end of the day, that's all this is. It's just ABC. They're just contingencies and behavior that we can track. But that's where we get down to the why. That's where we can break this down into, really easily digestible behavior. But that's where it matters, instead of just saying, do this because I said. Do this because I'm a consultant and I told you to. I think it's important for people to know, and hopefully, you have a relationship when you're in those situations where I always try to tell people, like, if you've ever heard differently, or if you have a different understanding of how this works, or, please ask, because I don't want you to do anything just because I'm telling you to do it. I'd rather, if you have a different way that looks differently from what I'm telling you, I'd rather we have a discussion about it because I'd like to explain to you why I'm asking you to do it this way. And it's not just because there's a reason for it, and I should be able to explain to you why I'm asking you to do it this way. So yeah,
I like it. So let's pivot into your thesis, getting some data to back up some of the things we've been talking about. Before we do though, let's just take this opportunity to remind ourselves and our audience, our listeners of the show, like how does a thesis work? What does a scientific question look like? And let's preface going into talk about your study, make sure we're all on the same page with kind of what's involved in doing what you've done.
Yeah. So I think it's important to remember with any sort of scientific investigation, no one study is the answer. So you can't really ever say that a study proves anything. So when we're working in empirical research, we're really just sort of standing on whatever research has come before. That's why a lit review is always really important. I'm borrowing from data that has been gathered prior to the study that I did. And we're looking at kind of a broad issue here. So I'm asking a very specific question and looking to answer just that really specific question out of kind of this bigger picture. So really, when we're reading a research paper, it's like one step or one little snippet in probably a series of many questions that would be required in order to answer, the full broad picture, the full broad brushstroke of that whole topic. So the goal to this is that, I'm building off of information that's come before. So I gathered whatever I could that had been done prior to this study that was looking at using teaching strategies or instructional design to support animal trainers. There wasn't a ton, so hopefully we're going to start to beef up the literature moving forward. And then the goal is to leave questions behind. So at the beginning, I'm like a very neat and tidy person. I like to kind of like tie up all my loose ends. And I actually have a sticky, it's right to my right still right now. My very first semester of grad school, I took research design with Dr. Christy Alligood. And it's pretty broad as is. I had like, secondary secondary variables and tertiary variables because I just had all these questions I wanted to ask. And she had to keep reminding me, you realize like you're not going to solve everything. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And she said, here's the quote that you need to keep with you this whole time. And it was, a really, really good research study is going to generate more questions than it answers. And I was like, okay, so it's literally written on a sticky note right next to me right now. And I keep it there. So that's the point, is that you want to answer your really specific question that you ask, and then you want to generate more questions so that you can continue to build off of the information that you've generated out of this study. So, if you ever see a study and at the end of it, it's like, well, we don't know about this and we don't know about this and we don't know about this. That's not a failure. That's actually a success because you generated the data to address your question. And now you have all of these different avenues that you can continue to investigate and run off of. So hopefully now you have people that are going to continue your lines of inquiry and generate more data. So that's kind of the little snippet on empirical research. But yeah, I touched already on, you kind of asked about like, where did this come from? And it really was generated out of the real work that we're doing out in the field and that you do in the field, in terms of, we know that we use different strategies to teach, and we have an idea of what we think works and what's successful and what's maybe less successful, but there isn't a lot of data to go off of. There's not like we have a ton of books that we can look at that's like, here's the best way to teach animal trainers. So this is a kind of an early attempt at starting to bring that under the systematic umbrella of empirical research design. So how do we best teach animal trainers how to apply behavior principles to our non-human learners, and really looking at that. And so I jumped into the literature and started to try to find what I could find. There really is not a lot. There was one study that applied the same teaching strategy as I used to killer whales. So super grateful for that one. And then there's a couple that used them for pouch rats. So Apopo doing the landmine work. They had a couple where they worked with their trainers down there. So leveraged that as much as I could. But a lot of the literature really, I said this in part one, it's really focused on applying behavior principles to the animals, which is amazing and hugely important. And of course, like your listeners get to hear from your guests all the time, the innovations and amazing work that's being done on that front. And so, but my like really strong feeling was that I want to have that same attention to detail that's now going to get shined on the appliers. So how do we have that same level of care given to our trainers? I want to make sure that we are being as detailed and as errorless with our trainers as we are with our animals. They deserve that level of care as well. And so the first place I kind of turned to look, and all of this, is obviously being guided and helped by Chrissy Alligood, was my thesis advisor. I think I probably have mentioned that, but I have to make sure I say that because she gets all the props. But was to look at instructional design. So it's not something that there's a lot of animal research on, but there's a ton of literature on that in terms of the human application. So a deep well to kind of start to mine from that angle. Looking at that angle, there wasn't a lot even from the human application that also measures your learner outcomes, which was something that was still important to me. I wanted to know not only how do we teach our trainers well, but then does that also impact our animals? So these were multiple layers that we were kind of working through. And the instructional design that I kept coming back to that seemed like it was going to fit the best was called behavior skills training, or BST is the short for it. And that's one area where I kept finding kind of some good overlap that I think was going to make sense. It was instructional design that had been studied in a lot of different settings and had been used in a lot of different applications. So everything from like interview skills all the way to car seat installation to teaching kids gun safety skills. But one of the really cool overlaps that I found was that it's used a lot to teach sports skills, which is a mechanical skill. So what we were going to be looking at as part of the thesis, my narrow sliver that I was pulling out was mechanical skills for reinforcement delivery and all the hand mechanics that trainers need to be able to master. And it just so happened that my lab partner was also going to be doing BST. So I mentioned that I think in part one too. So she did hers for cheerleading, like high level cheerleading stunts, which was amazing. I did all of her. She did my IOA, my inner observer agreement, and I did hers. So I got to watch all of these insane videos of people flying through the air. Wild, amazing stuff. But there was some good overlap there in terms of giving feedback on these mechanical skills and having some good success with that. So that seemed like a good place to go. It's a 4-component teaching strategy. So you start out with instruction, use a modeling phase where they watch the skill, and then there's a rehearsal and feedback component. So kind of a 4-tiered program that we were looking at. And then I had to kind of think about practicality. So would this be something that would be functional? And some of the drawbacks to it are, when you're thinking about a zoo setting and a consultant, there's usually 1 or 2 consultants, or if you're just in a zoo, you have, a behavior staff that's usually fairly small, and zoo staffs can be rather large. So if we're thinking about one consultant or a small number of, behavior staff, and then potentially a larger zoo staff, that creates a lot of work for one person to have to individually go through and offer rehearsal and feedback. So that was one kind of challenge with that we initially ran into. And so then I had to start asking questions about how would I scale up that BST program in a way that would be functional. And that's where PORTL came back into play. So it's already something that we use, already something that we think is effective. And the component that is really useful to me in PORTL in this setting is that it has a built-in peer feedback system already. So you have the trainer and the learner working together, and they're already giving each other feedback on what's happening during those PORTL games. So I was like, well, I could just take that and actually replace the rehearsal feedback components of BST with PORTL. And that takes care of that really labor-intensive piece with peer feedback. But then I needed to find support for the peer feedback piece, which I did find. I found a lot of good support in the literature about peer feedback for teaching discrete trial training. So basically ABC runs, which it was in a human application, but it's the same type of ABC training that we do with our learners. So I had some support there that was going to hopefully work out in our favor and do well. So that kind of took care of my teaching protocol. It was going to be BST. So instruction and modeling, I would take care of as the expert instructor, quote unquote. And then the rehearsal and feedback was going to be covered under PORTL, under that peer-to-peer. And then I needed to figure out the generalization piece. So I need this not only to work in the classroom, I would measure that and make sure that we got behavior change there, but then does it actually move out into the field where we want it to be with live animals? So I needed to build that component in, and again, that was something that we had piloted and anecdotally we had seen do well when we could take it out, try it with goats, and then move it in front of other animals. So wrote in a component of that where we were going to move it out, try it with goats, take some pre-post measures with that, and then move it in front of something larger. So I asked to use a giraffe. I'm down here with my good friends at the zoo here. So that was kind of a nice step up, literally from goats. So we would be able to see how those skills transferred across multiple species. So that kind of brought me to my full research question, which was then looking at, does a behavior skills training program utilizing PORTL for those last two components, how does it affect animal trainer procedural fidelity? And that's just the fancy language for how accurate they are in all the steps that I had written out for how they executed all of the hand mechanics that were required for them. And then do those skills generalize to the field? So to in situ situations, so out in front of an animal. And then I wrote in some additional ones because I wanted to make it extra fun. So I had two secondary dependent variables that I wanted to measure. So that was, again, looking at the animal's response. So I wanted to see, does an improvement in trainer behavior actually correlate with an improvement in animal behavior as well? And then looking at, again, that generalization between species. So does this actually, can I replicate this with another larger species? So that's where we started with my research question. You want me to just keep on keeping on? All right. So I had my participants. I got 6 participants to do this with me. The studies that I had all looked at, usually they had between 2 and 4 participants for each of those studies. So this isn't a huge increase from that, but again, in the effort to scale up a little bit, I wanted to have it be a slightly larger sample size. And then this is just, again, things that will need replication in the future as we kind of gather more data and continue to look at this. And then I decided to run it as a 3-day workshop. So we had 3 days of workshop time. It was 2-hour workshops each day. One day was baseline, one day was intervention, where they actually went through the BST program. And then the third day was all my post measurement, where I could get the follow-up data on everything. And then broke it into 4 stages, essentially, for BST. So this is a little bit of shaping again. So how do we set them up to be successful? I wrote a task analysis, so broke out what the hand mechanics, so basically cueing a behavior, what all the hand mechanics would look like for cueing bridging that behavior, and then the delivery of the reinforcer, broke all that out into observable steps, and then broke that into 4 different parts. And then each of those stages added in a different skill every stage. And then we moved through that. At each stage, they got the full BST treatment. So they started with me, they got a short, brief PowerPoint of what the component skills were for that stage. So we went through the task analysis. This is what you're going to be doing. I had an assistant with me. So we then moved into modeling, where they watched us do 10 trials, where they could see what it looked like. And then we sent them off to do PORTL with their partner. They were set up in pairs that were consistent through the whole thing. And then they were to give feedback to each other. So the learner gave the trainer feedback on every single trial. It was just short feedback. So either, yep, that was great, or, no, your hand moved early. So it's supposed to be just short, small snippets of feedback. They also had a visual feedback chart. So as they went, they were setting their reinforcer token on like a yes or a no. So either yes, you got all the steps right for that one, or no, you didn't. So they were getting multiple types of feedback for every trial that they went through. And then they went through that until they had until they hit a mastery criteria of 90%. So out of the steps, they had to have 90% correct. And then so that was their mastery criteria. And then we had a stability criteria, where I wanted them to maintain 90% mastery for 3 sessions in a row. So that would tell me it's not just a fluke. You actually are getting these criteria, and you can maintain that over 3 sessions. So that's what they were looking for. And that was all based, though, off of their peer scoring. So it wasn't me scoring them. They were scoring each other. And that will come into play a little bit later. So we did it. We turned them loose. Of course, we did our baseline first. I should make that very, very clear. So day 1 was baseline day. So we went out, we did 10 trials with goats. They didn't get any instructions except to target their animal to the best of their ability 10 times. So we did that 10 trials with a goat. Each of them had their own goat. 10 trials with a giraffe. They all trained the same giraffe, because switching out 6 giraffe was a little bit tricky. So everyone trained the same giraffe. And then we did actually 30 trials. So 3 sets of 10 trials with each other in PORTL. So I had good baseline data on what their hand mechanics looked like before any of the BST started. So ran them through the 4 stages. And then one little note to say, so some of the I don't know if you want to hear like some of my learning on the fly things that happened on the fly. Yeah. Okay. So on the second day, so the day we did BST, I had one participant that ended up not being able to make it that day, which, of course you wake up and then it's like, oh, great. So I had baseline data for them, but I was like, oh, I don't want to lose this whole data set. So I ended up having my assistant sit in that day for her partner, so I wouldn't lose that second data set. And that person ended up coming in early on the 3rd day, and I ran her BST with me as her partner. So this comes in handy later, because I actually got to run some comparisons that I wouldn't have been able to run otherwise. And I'll talk about those in the outcomes. But that also made me realize something as I was observing in that second day, that I was not seeing, as I just was casually, anecdotally observing as I was kind of circulating and making sure cameras were running and all that, that I knew that I was going to be scoring differently than they were scoring. So I was going to be scoring all of these sessions later off of video footage. And even just watching as I walked by, I was noticing that my scoring was going to probably be fairly different than the peer scoring. And so I decided at the end of day 2, so at the end of the BST interventions, that at the start of day 3, I was going to extend stage 4. So I had them continue stage 4 without additional instruction to get to a full 10 sessions. So the 10 trial sessions. And I did that because I wanted to see how long it would actually take them to reach a mastery criteria and stability criteria with me scoring if they hadn't already. So hopefully that makes sense. So with them scoring each other, I was guessing that they were going to score each other at mastery before I would have scored them at mastery. And so stage 4 would have been the only stage that I could have extended that and not had it impact any stages behind it. So I presented it to them as a warm-up on day 4 because we had no more portal coming after that. I just wanted to warm them up for the morning. But then I got additional data on that stage that I could then extend out and see how long would it actually take to hit mastery. So I'll throw that in there. That was sort of an on-the-fly thing. I had, Christy on text, and I was like, okay, I'm doing something weird. I don't know if this is crazy, but hopefully it's a good idea. And it ended up working out great. And then that final day, we went out and took all the post data. So back to goats, everyone worked the same goat that they worked on that first day. We did another 10 trials. And then back down to giraffe, worked that same giraffe. Everyone did another 10 trials. Took all the data. And then I watched hours and hours of video of small foam turtles and people poking them. That was my life for like 2 months, which was so fun. My daughter would always come in. She's like, oh, you're still watching turtles. I was like, yep, you got it. But the data was so fun to watch come together. Like I'm guessing probably your listeners are like nerdy people too. And so like, never have I ever been so happy to put stuff in a graphing program and watch graphs come out. It was, I don't know, it was like the lottery. It was like the greatest thing ever. But for the results, I broke it out in a lot of different ways. So I am not a math person, and this was the most fun I've ever had with numbers in my whole life. Because it was behavior in number form. So I started by looking at each individual participant and looked at individual trends and broke that out in 2 different ways. So I first looked at the number of trials that each individual person ran that hit a criteria of meeting that 100% procedural fidelity, meaning that every single step in the task analysis for whatever stage they were on was done correctly. They had 100% accuracy for that stage. So that was one way I broke it out. And then the second way I broke it out is I wanted to look at individual tasks. So for each individual step, how many were they actually missing? So if they missed that 100% criteria, were they missing just one task, or were they missing like 4 out of 5? So I wanted to know like how inaccurate were they being? Was it really inaccurate or just a little bit inaccurate? So that was my first drop in. And had a bunch of data come out on that. And the general trend was when we did goats, 5 of the 6 participants had 0 trials that hit 100% accuracy. One participant had 1 trial that had one that had 100% accuracy. So on average, 4% of the trials in baseline with goats hit that accuracy criteria, but 59% of their task analysis steps were correct. So 60% of the time on average, they were doing the task analysis right, but it never panned out really to be 100% accurate. So, kind of hit or miss. And it was similar with the giraffe. So 13% of that 100%, only 13% of the trials had 100%. And this one was interesting. It's a little bit higher because one participant with a giraffe had 80% accuracy in that baseline session. But there's some thoughts behind that. That's my one outlier for the study, which was interesting. And then similar, they had about 60% of their task analysis on average across all participants that were correct. I wish I could show you graphs because they're so beautiful and pretty, but someday we'll like all get together and look at graphs and drink coffee together, and it will be a lot of fun. So then we moved into the behavior skills training, and I looked at the same data. So again, baseline, I looked at, and all these baselines I measured with the stage 4 task analysis. So the full components, all of the different mechanical hand skills that I was looking at. So in stage 1 and stage 2, it was really basic stuff. So really just delivering a reinforcer block. So if you've played PORTL before, you kind of know what that reinforcement system looks like and feels like. And they all across the board did really well with those early stages. All scored well, all hit mastery really quickly. So they really only did 3 or 4 sessions because they hit mastery within those first 3 sessions for most participants. And their scoring lined up really well with my scoring. So we all scored pretty closely together. So that was interesting to see. Hypothesis-wise, it tells me that a lot of that hand mechanics in those early stages probably have some prior learning history. They had some stuff that they brought with them to the table, which was cool. Stage 3 is where it started to get kind of cool to start breaking down the data a little bit more. So in stage 3, 4 of the 6 participants needed extended training. So they needed more sessions than just 3 to reach the mastery and then stability criteria that I was looking for. So on average, 68% of the trials from my scoring, only 68% of the trials met that accuracy criteria that I was looking for. But 92% of the steps were correct. So there was just a few of those steps that were starting to hold them back from hitting mastery. And this is where I started to break out individual criterion that people were missing. And it was typically bridge timing and actually hitting the bridge right when the behavior happened. So this is where I could start to pull out individual skills where I was like, that's the skill that they're struggling with on this specific stage. And this is the stage where there started to be a lot more discrepancy too. So their their peer scoring was scoring each other pretty high. And my scoring tended to be a lot more stringent. So I was scoring them a lot lower than they were scoring each other. So this is where I was probably starting to notice in just my casual observations, like, this is probably, I need to probably take some additional data. So stage 4, another kind of echoed stage 3 where, again, it took longer for them to reach mastery and stability based on their peer scoring. And again, there was a lot wider gap between my scoring from video and their scoring of each other. So this one, they had an average of 74 trials that met that accuracy criteria, and then an average of 96 of the task analysis steps were correct. So just as a comparison, that already was a really significant increase. So baseline, it was 0% trials that hit accuracy. So that was 74% compared to 0. And then in baseline, they only had 30% of the task analysis steps that were correct. That increased to 96. So that was already a big jump just on improvement in the classroom setting. So that was cool to see from that. The other cool thing about that was that even though there were more trials, so more individual opportunities to make errors in that stage 4 run, they made fewer errors in stage 4 than they made cumulatively during baseline. So there were more opportunities to make errors, and they made, there were 3 times more trials and they made, I think it was 5 times less errors, even though there were more opportunities to make them. So they decreased their errors significantly based on going through the BST model. So that was cool to see. And then we had the post measures. So we moved back out into the field on that last day. We saw all the participants improve in their measurements out in the field. So on average, again, just looking at averages, their accuracy in goats improved from 4% up to 48%. And then the number of steps that was correct improved from 59% up to 89%. And then for giraffe, it was 13% up to 45% and 60% up to 93%. So big changes across the board. So that was exciting, but where it got really cool for me is that I decided to go back in and look at specific error assessments. So where were the errors making, and who did we actually see errors decrease in individuals? I didn't want just the averages. I wanted the individual data to just make sure, like, did we have like one really high performer and that was skewing my averages to one end or the other? And that actually was where the coolest data came from, in my opinion, where we saw huge decreases across participants. The lowest average was a 42% decrease in errors for a participant, all the way up to 94% decrease in errors. And then we got to the goats, and this was where it was really, really fun. So I did the same calculations that I did for humans that I did for the animals. And what we saw overall was that for goats, there was a 73%. These are for humans. For humans overall, they had a 73% reduction in errors in their work with goats. They had an 81% reduction in errors in their work with giraffes. And then during BST overall, they had an 81% reduction in errors. So just by going through a systematic training curriculum or course, it stripped away that many errors from what they had done prior to. But with goats, they had a 93% reduction in errors from before to after. And for most of the goats, they had, or 3 of the 6, so half of the goats, they reduced their errors completely. So we had 3 of the 6 goats that went from multiple errors to 100% reduction to 0. So to see that was pretty cool. And the pre-post video is amazing to see goats that were kind of like all over the place. And then with these few tweaks, and the training wasn't what we would call perfect. There were still some errors on the human side, but it was enough of a clear communication that the goats all of a sudden had this new set of contingencies to follow. And it was like this, goat that just lined up. And it was the wildest thing. It was my favorite thing to see, because all of the trainers were like, oh my gosh, this is magic. And we were like, no, this is science. You guys you just are setting up this nice, beautiful ABC that they can predict. And here it is. So that was cool to see. And it was really gratifying to have that show up in the data that, yeah, it was working, and it was working well. And we had the numbers to back it up. So that was pretty exciting to have that all fall out. Yeah. You want me to keep going? I can give you the summary in the future, or you have questions first?
Keep going. No, we're gonna run out of time for questions. Do I have questions? Do I have questions? She asks. But I definitely want to hear the summary. I don't want to not include that. So please don't feel rushed. Please share it with us. I didn't set up the antecedents well to not feel rushed today, but please don't feel rushed.
No, I mean, in general, the hypothesis were all supported. So it supported using that BST and using the peer-to-peer feedback was supported. So we saw behavior change that not only worked in the classroom, we did see it translate and generalize out into the field environment and across species. And then excitingly, we did see that translate into animal behavior change as well. So there was that improvement that correlated with the trainer behavior change correlated with an improvement in animal behavior. So that was for me one of the coolest outcomes to see. It wasn't just about hey guys, do this so you can train better. I mean, it actually, there was a measurable benefit to the animal learners. So yay.
Yeah, and that's so cool, because if you think about trainers beginning to train, one reinforcer, I think, for a lot of individuals is getting the behavior that we in our minds expect to get from the training. And so to be able to get some goats up to 100%, I mean, what reinforcement we're probably being able to help our young green trainers make contact with in that context, and get some reinforcement history for them in the umbrella concept of all of the behaviors associated with training. That's amazing. Are those goat videos available anywhere?
Not yet. We're working
Not
on,
yet.
not yet. I have to do some editing because for privacy and all that. But I'm hopefully we'll get to present this coming year. I'm hopefully going to be able to get out and present. And then once I get those things edited, hopefully I can pass those along too. I just have to crop out some heads.
Yeah, totally understand. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, hey, thanks so much for sharing all of that. I'm going to go back and digest that all. I guess one more question. This is as you identified at the start, a single study and a single set of data. Like, has there been any other individuals interested in replicating this work or answering some of the questions that your work brought up so far?
Not yet. I'm hoping to publish this fall. So this will go out to hopefully a broader audience, and hopefully it will get picked up on and maybe pulled in a couple direction. There's a ton of additional research questions that came out of this too. So just watching the data back, stuff like it looked like certain home positions produced better outcomes than others. So that could be an additional research question. The fact that I had the participant that sat out the one day made it so that I was the live observer and the video observer, and there were discrepancies in my data against myself. So, I have additional research questions about, video feedback versus live feedback, and some questions about, what additional training would it take to change that, or could we add in a video modeling component, or some self-report or self-assessment with video. So there was just a ton of stuff that came out just from running through the process and looking at the data and sitting with the data. That hopefully this will continue to go on, hopefully to be digested by other people. But if not, I know that I'll continue to use the information that's come out of this and hopefully be a better coach and a better teacher, and share that with whoever I'm in contact with, and maybe you and your listeners.
I would love to see it. That's interesting. It made me in the moment think about teaching Portal, and these are not well thought out thoughts at all, but I'm just sharing them with you now. Like taking a bunch of mini camera tripods on a console, setting them up, and getting the filmers to watch themselves back. And they'll probably be able to pick up stuff and give different feedback and give different feedback for themselves as well. Through film. That's cool. I like that.
Having video, I think, is key. It's amazing. Game changing. Yeah.
Is there something you do? Get your participants to film themselves playing Portal?
Yes, actually, not Portal all the time, but when we are out training, whenever possible, sure. we'll take video of that and watch it back together. Because a lot of times, stuff that I'm telling them, it's so hard for them to know. But if they can see it, it's a lot easier for them to be able to change something that they can see, like, oh, my hand moved there, or oh, my foot was doing this, that, and the other thing. But also just, we found skills in this that the lacking of certain things that didn't generalize as well. What do we need to do boosters in between maybe the BST program and moving into the outside environment, or how can we best allocate, the expert time to support specific skills, whereas other ones might be better supported by peer-to-peer feedback. So there's just so many places that can.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, this can run. So it was
and
fun.
Was the difference in the data that or the peer-to-peer feedback that you gave versus the peer, was that just down to your knowledge and experience, or was it also down to the fact that you were watching the videos back and you kind of had a different medium to get that data?
Yeah, there was a couple things. So I scored more hard on video playback than I did live. And some of those I think were snap judgments in the moment where, maybe you're just like, no, it's close enough. Or, I have the luxury of slowing down on video where I can catch, did their finger actually hit at the moment that they bridged, or all those like small nuanced things that you just can do. So I was off on a couple of mine by 10 to 20%, which was interesting to see.
Yeah.
That even I was more strict than my live self on video playback. But it was cool to be able to identify those things and know that even me against me, there are some errors that you make when you're giving that feedback live. So having that video to be able to go back to and be able to pick through a little more strategically and really be able to slow down and look for those fine details. It really is useful and helpful and a tool to leverage and use when possible. Yeah.
Amazing. Love it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for sharing all of that, Megan. Just before we do officially wrap up, though, and we mentioned this in part one, but can you just let everyone listening know where they can go online to get in touch with you, find out more?
Yeah. If you jump on behaviorworks.org, there's the consulting tab, and you can find everyone's bios on there, and our email addresses are there. You can get in touch with the whole team.
Amazing. We will, of course, link to all of this in the show notes as well, Megan. This has been so much fun. And so from myself and on behalf of everyone listening, thank you so much for taking the time to come and hang out with us twice on the Animal Training Academy podcast show. It's really appreciated.
Thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
And thank you so much for listening as well. This is your host, Ryan Cartledge, signing off from this episode of the Animal Training Academy podcast show. We hope today's conversation inspired you and equipped you with new tools for your trainer's toolbox. Remember, every challenge in training is an opportunity to learn and sharpen your animal training geekery. Embrace the rough patches, learn from them, and keep improving. And don't forget, the path to growing your skills and expanding your knowledge continues beyond this episode. Visit www.atamember.com to join our supportive membership, where you will find a community of trainers just like you. Together, we're making a huge positive difference in the lives of animal and human learners worldwide. Until next time, keep honing your skills, stay awesome, and remember, every interaction with an animal or human learner is your opportunity to create ripples. We're here cheering you on every step of the way. See you at the next episode.